In November, we have our Vintage Radio and Phonograph Society annual convention, so I'm going to be pretty much tied up with that, and that comes in, I think, the third week of November, the third weekend. So I understand you've had Jim Sargent, our president of the Vintage Radio Phonograph Society. He is one of the best speakers I've seen. He gave a great presentation this past weekend at our monthly meeting on tubes and the history of tubes. So he's a great speaker. He's been the president of our club, the Vintage Radio Phonograph Society of North Texas. And again, for those of you that are interested maybe in joining another club, we're always looking for new members. So we have a very simple webpage, vrps.org, and feel free to peruse that site if you want. And if you ever wanted to come out to one of our meetings, feel free to do so. Again, you're also welcome to come to our convention. If you want to get involved in the auction and buy a radio, just keep in mind that you would have to go ahead and sign up and become a member. Our member dues are $20 for the year or so. But again, the auction is a pretty good deal if you're ever interested in getting a radio. And a lot of the radios have been already worked on by a lot of the club members. So keep that in mind and you get some great deals, especially on consoles. It seems like consoles, as beautiful as they are, as intricate as they are, I think what happens nowadays, nobody has room for these things and everybody just wants to get rid of them. And you can get some fantastic deals on some very nice original consoles, even some that have been worked on and done very well. So with that said,
push that too.
I have got the magic button here. Again, my name is Walt. I'm the Vintage Radio guy. I have been selling radios at the Frisco Mercantile now for the last, say, since 2013, so just over 10 years. And this is something I've been doing as a hobby the last, say, 10 years or so. But before that, I was a little bit, had a different career. And I was a meteorologist, a weatherman for about 45 years, going back into the 70s. I started off in the U.S. Air Force and worked for the Air Weather Service. And when I got out working as a civilian at Department of Defense up at Selfridge Air National Guard Base and continuing in the world of weather. My specialty at the time was radar, and I really liked working radar. I really kind of was into the warning and operations and issuing weather warnings. The stuff you hear on TV, whether it be coming from your local weathercaster, those originate from the National Weather Service. In '82, I got a job at the local National Weather Service office in Detroit and worked there for about 11 years. And then I worked my way down south where I really wanted to get back to the south and worked my way down to Tampa, and then finally got a job in upper management in the National Weather Service at our regional headquarters in downtown Fort Worth. They gave me a fancy title for about 25 years. I was what they called a warning coordination meteorologist. I dealt a lot with the media, but mainly a lot with the operations of the National Weather Service. A lot of the nuts and bolts and stuff that the guys do at our local Weather Service office on Beach Street in Fort Worth. A lot of those operations, I basically kind of helped put that together. The warning program, the winter weather program, worked a lot with the emergency alert system with the FCC, and just a lot of different things. The hurricane program was the big thing on my plate. We did a lot of activities there, and it was a very interesting career, but I always had an interest in electronics. And when I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of time in the basement tinkering with electronics. I didn't know what I was doing, but I'd just play around with stuff. And my dad was, when he was in high school, he got a job at a local radio TV shop, and he learned about electronics, and actually they sent him out doing house calls, you know, fixing TVs and radios. And he even signed up for a course when he was 15 and spent a lot of money for that era, but got one of those radio courses where you got a book every week and learn about condensers and resistors, and they would send a radio, then a signal generator out for you to build, and then finally they finished up with an oscilloscope. And I remember I used to play with that oscilloscope. It was neat watching the little lines going across, but I didn't understand what it was, and I said, one day I'll figure this out. But in the interim, I just was waiting to get old enough where I can get out of the house and be my own guy. And when I joined the Air Force to be a weather guy, I was doing everything I could. I was sleeping about 3 or 4 hours a night, but I was going to college, I was being a weather guy, I was restoring Mustangs, I was chasing girls, traveling around the country, going to college. And then I started restoring consoles. I didn't know anything about the electronics, but I loved the shape of those consoles, the look of those things. And I did about 10 of them. And that's the first one I restored, which was a 1938 Spartan made out of Jackson, Michigan, model 880A with a shortwave and AM band on it. And beautiful radio. When the guys, since I worked shift work being a weather guy, the guys in the barracks, most of them were working days. So during the daytime hours, when I was back in the barracks, I would drag these radios into the latrine and I'd strip them. And of course, all the caustic materials and solvents and stuff like that would leave a pretty heavy scent. And then I'd wheel it back into my room. When guys were coming in around 4 o'clock, they'd walk into the latrine and say, "What is that smell? What the hell's going on out here? You know, what is that? We smell chemicals all the time." They would complain to the first sergeant. First sergeant and I were buddies. So he goes, "I don't know what that is. I don't know. Maybe just cleaning materials, you know, must be what the janitor's using." But I used to restore radios right there in the latrine, and got about 10 of them done. Now, after I left the military, went about 30 years before I ever touched a radio again. And I was coming back from a business trip for the government, driving through San Antonio, Texas, stopped at a little antique mall. And there was this little tiny Emerson, model 544 AM radio in really bad condition. I think I picked it up for about 15 bucks, brought it home, and I told the ex-wife, I said, "You know what, I'm going to go ahead and try to restore the finish on this little radio." Now, when I was younger, I never really had any interest in tabletop radios. They just didn't appeal to me. I loved the big consoles. Well, something flipped in that 30-year period. All of a sudden, I took this great attraction to these little tabletops. I restored that thing. It had a beautiful round dial, teal-colored, red pointer, and turned out pretty good. But I still didn't understand the electronic portion of that radio. So I went on eBay, I found a guy that sold his services to repair radios. He was a former radio repairman, but he said, "For 75 bucks, send me your radio along with that check, and I'll work on that radio and send it back to you." So of course, this was the early days, 2007, 2008. I was kind of like, oh my God, I was asking a lot. Send him my radio plus a check. I hope I can get this thing back. But I checked him out, and he was legitimate. And within about 10 days after I sent it out, I got the radio back. So what I did was the old reverse engineering. I took it apart, looked at what the guy did. I studied the schematic for that particular radio, and then I started buying radios and said, let me see if I could go ahead and repair these. Now, of course, in the interim, I did a lot of reading on how to do radio repair. I bought the proper equipment, made sure I didn't electrocute myself in the middle of the night when I was working on these radios. But the idea was to really do as much as I can to figure out what the expert did. And by doing that, taking my time, I was able to slowly but gradually and very methodically learn how to repair radios. And I found it very fascinating that radios going across a spectrum of time really matured very quickly. When you look at when radio technology was at its infancy to where it came to be around 1940, that was a tremendous jump in technology over a narrow window of time. But basically, learning how to read schematics was extremely important in doing radio repair, and then also learning from other guys in the club. And there are a lot of guys at our Vintage Radio Phonograph Society Club, very knowledgeable. A lot of the guys are engineers, quick to share information, which I found was a great resource to tap onto. So that's what started it all. Why collect vintage radios? What's the purpose of that? Well, what I found was that American radios during this era, when I was going to say basically from the mid-30s to the mid-50s, were extremely artistic, have a lot of beauty, a lot of historical significance. You think about the era, the Great Depression, World War II, America's Greatest Generation. A lot of things were going on during that window of time. The quality of radios by our U.S. manufacturers at this time were unsurpassed. We had by far the best built radios for the dollar. High quality, from about mid-30s up to about mid-50s. After that, the quality of the radios dropped off quickly, almost like a waterfall. And there are two reasons for that. One was the advent of television, where a lot of the companies were putting their money into the TV side of the fence. And secondly, the Japanese invasion of radios, being able to mass produce radios very economically, basically put our companies out of business. We just couldn't compete. So the only way the manufacturers could even keep their operations going was they started cheapening the chassis and the components in the chassis. And that's when I do the work on it. I really see a drop off in quality of the chassis components, especially once you get beyond 55. So it's something to consider when you're out looking for radios, is that even though radio might have a lot of visual appeal, keep in mind as you get in the late 50s, early 60s, there's going to be sometimes issues with components that are insurmountable. And so it's a real problem. Radios of this era, it's a valuable investment. Radios have been going up in value, especially the wood radios of the 30s over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So if you happen to purchase a radio and it's in good quality shape, it's been recapped, new capacitors and so forth, it's working condition, it's going to have value, and it's probably going to keep going up in value. And like coins, the value of the radio is dependent on the supply, the number made. So if you happen to have a rare radio that had very few produced, but it has intrinsic value in a sense that it has eye appeal, it's limited production, you may have a little bit of a gem on your hands. So brief history of radios, and I'm not going to go too deep into this, but really there are many people that were involved in the success of AM radio, starting off all the way going back to Heinrich Hertz, where he basically proved that, yeah, radio waves can be transmitted through the atmosphere. You had Tesla that made one of the first broadcasts in the late 1890s. And of course, Marconi. Marconi was probably the one guy that everybody wants to go ahead and say he's probably the father of radio, if you're going to give anybody, because he did a lot of different things. Interesting story about Marconi. He's Italian. I'm part Italian. So, of course, I thought, hey, this is a pretty interesting guy, part of my national heritage. But he went to the Italian government multiple times saying, hey, I've got this thing that I can transmit without a wire communications from point A to point B. And the Italian government goes, yeah, well, okay, that's nice. And what he was doing was he was looking for someone to back him. He was looking for investors. And the problem was once, twice, three times he went to the Italian government and they just dismissed him. So he went to England and they backed him. And that's where he started his company, British Marconi. And then Marconi expanded to Canada and also American Marconi. So with that said, Marconi did a lot of neat things. He was very methodical. And he was a kind of a savvy businessman too. He ran into some patent issues always, but the thing is, he won some, he lost some. But in the end, Marconi was a shrewd operator, but he was also a very smart individual. Fessenden, another pioneer, contributed to broadcasting in the United States. Lena Forrest, of course, his big contribution was the Audion tube. And without that tube, you wouldn't have the amplification that's needed for radio broadcasting. So he's very important. One of the things that really propelled radio, and you hate to look at a disaster, but the Titanic disaster, although a lot of people died, there were 700 people that were saved. And part of that was because they had Marconi radios on board. And they had two Marconi. Marconi operated in a matter that he said, if you buy my transmitter, you have to have my people working operating that. So there were two Marconi operators, and they went ahead and put out that signal where, I believe it was the Carpathia, went ahead, picked it up, and they were able to steam along and pick up 700 survivors. And after that, I think it was a board of inquiries on the high seas and so forth, they went ahead and said, hey, look, we're going to make it mandatory to have radios aboard all ships. And we're going to have to make sure, though, that the radios are compatible, that if you have one company that produces a radio, another company should be able to receive that signal. Prior to that time, if you bought a Marconi transmitter, only a Marconi receiver could pick up that. So then you have Edwin Armstrong, of course. he went ahead and produced the superheterodyne circuit, and that's what we have nowadays, and it's still operating like it did back in that period of time. All things have just gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. Radio really took off from around 1919, and this was a quirky thing. This was right after World War I, and what's interesting about this is the U.S. government, the Navy, they wanted to corner the market on the AM band. They wanted that band for themselves. Well, there were powers that be saying, no, we really want, like General Electric and Westinghouse, they said, we want to use that for commercial broadcasting. Well, at the time, the U.S. Navy was buying all its telecommunications equipment from British Marconi, the American subsidiary in the United States. And the U.S. government was saying, we don't like the fact that we're trusting our telecommunications equipment to a foreign country, England. That was our parent. But back then, for national security concerns, they wanted an American company for our telecommunications equipment. So Woodrow Wilson, at the time, president, along with others in the Navy, said, look, you go make. They went to General Electric, they went to Westinghouse, they said, you go make Mr. Marconi a deal he can't refuse and buy that American division of Marconi. And they did. The deal was consummated in 1919, and the Radio Corporation, RCA, came to be. And the parents were General Electric, Westinghouse, and a fruit company. So they held the greatest shares of common stock. And of course, the first licensed radio stations, and there's always a debate on which ones are the first, but KDKA typically gets the nod for being the first station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. WWJ in Detroit was also, in 1920, they were broadcasting, and WJZ up in New York. Actually, I think it was New Jersey where they were broadcasting out of Newark, but covered the New York City area. But WJZ has also been considered one of the first broadcast licensed stations in the U.S. I know this is hard to see, but if any of you want to take a picture of that, this is just a bunch of resources. I was able to find that. A lot of information about radio, the FCC. I think there's even something on ham radio there, but a lot of the different people we're talking about, like Marconi. Feel free to take a look at those websites, but if you can take a picture of that, that'd be kind of a good way to capture that. Radio styles in the 1920s. We're still in the amateur period at this time, experimenting. And when you look at these radios from that era, the breadboards, early to mid-20s, were mainly for amateurs. And you had basically 3 coils, you had some tubes. Not a pleasant thing to look at, not something that you'd want to basically have in your living room. The early, what they call casket radios, they started taking the breadboards and started encasing them either in metal or in brown wood cases. Again, not much eye appeal there. In the late 20s, they started developing these kind of monstrosity-looking radios called low boys and high boys. Again, the technology was starting to improve rapidly, but still the cases were, I don't know, they didn't look like a radio that I envisioned or were found appealing to the eye. And the biggest problem with those radios, the dial. You had this massive box with a big speaker in it. The dial was the size of a postage stamp. So that was where we were at in the late 20s. This is the golden era, the 1930s. This is when radios really started to have tremendous eye appeal because they started realizing, the manufacturers, that people, when they listened to a radio, they'd sit and stare at whatever they were hearing. So why not make the radio eye appealing with a big dial? So we went from the postage stamp to round dials. And when you look at this image, you have your cathedral radios from the late 20s, early 30s on the far left. Still a postage stamp, but at least they were smaller. They could fit on the tabletop. Then you had your tombstone radios. By the 1934, the first round dials were starting to show up. And you had this radio here. This is a Crosley. There's color in it. Actually had red, which was a real stretch for the era. I mean, everything was brown, and more brown. But the middle radio, a simplex with a tuning eye. Then the far right is a Sears Silvertone. That's model 4465 AM and 2 shortwave bands on it. That particular radio was Sears' best tabletop radio. Sold for $35 in 1936. That $35 is now worth $750. And if you get a good looking radio like that nowadays, all completely electronically restored and the case refinished, it's worth about that much, about between $600 and $800. Then you get these tabletops. The tabletops were just absolutely gorgeous with big dials. This is Sears tabletop from 1936. This is a Fairbanks Morse with an extremely colorful dial and a tuning eye. Then you get into the consoles. The consoles were the grand finale of the radio era. You had a radio such as this. This is called an Arvin Rhythm Queen. There was a Rhythm King and a Rhythm Queen. I think the Rhythm Queen was a better looking radio than the King. There was definitely more feminine look to it with curviness and style. Big, beautiful dial with a tuning eye. And then to the right of that, of course, the Zenith black dials. And those were very popular, very expensive for the era, but very popular and very good radios. Now we get into the radios from the 1940s. Around 1940, there was a change in chassis design. We went from transformer style chassis, which the chassis were very heavy. Current was typically, the voltages were 350 to 450 operating, to the small tabletops. We're now down to what we call about 100 to 110 volts AC, no more transformers, lightweight, played as good, if not better, than the older 1930s radios. 1/3 the cost. So around 1940 was the turning point. 3940 is we went from the old transformer version of radio technology to what they call the AC-DC. All the tubes in the AC-DC sets were basically like the old Christmas lights. They were in a series. So if one tube went out, the set would just shut down. But much more economical. And also it was the start of standardization in radio chassis production. All the manufacturers got together and they decided on a standard called the All-American 5 or All-American 6 tube lineup, which allowed the repairmen who were going crazy by this time saying, look, we can't stock every tube for all these 1930s radios because every manufacturer would have a different chassis, often with several different types of tubes. So by the time 1940s came around, you're dealing with 5, maybe 6 tubes, and that's really covered about 80% of your radios in general. 1950s, pretty much what you see there is no more wood. The cost to make a wood case radio was getting prohibitive, and the technology at the time allowed for colorization, where bakelite, which was what was used in the 30s and the 40s, that material basically brown, brown, and more brown, that's all you got. With the advent of introduction of plastic around 1950, they were able to colorize the radios. Now the radios became lighter again and less expensive, and allowed these companies to stay in business. But again, the lack of wood. So you had a lot of great visual appeal with a lot of the radios, and the sound quality was excellent. So when you look at Art Deco, now I love Art Deco radios, and the Art Deco window was probably from the 30s and through the middle 40s. Typically a lot of grill work, a lot of curvaceousness, just a lot of design styles. And as you got away from this era, you got into the box look. But in this era, and these are some of the radios I have in my house, mainly bakelite, mainly plastic, and also some other materials such as Plascon. I have some examples here of radios, and it's a sampling. Your typical radios from the 1930s were wood. As you got in the 40s, it was a mixture of wood and bakelite. Bakelite was pre-plastic. Bakelite was used from about in the 20s, early 30s, all the way up to about 1950. Catalin was a special composite material. It's kind of like bakelite, but it's it can fracture pretty easily. But it has the ability to come up with these beautiful designs. So when you get a chance, walk by this and just look at the fissuring and the colorization. These radios, if you happen to have a Catlin that's not cracked, it's definitely got some value. I've seen Catlin radios go for as much as $2,000 or $3,000 at auctions because they're so limited, but they also have extreme beauty in their design and in the actual material itself. Here's an example of a radio I started working on. This is Catlin. This is a Bendix, and Bendix made everything from automotive parts to airplane parts. They also dabbled in radios. And this radio, I started working on it in the buffing of the case. And if you look at it initially, you wouldn't even know that it was Catlin until you started doing the cleanup. And I started looking, I said, oh my God, I said, I have a Catlin radio. This thing's gonna be worth $400 or $500 when I get it done. Another type of material that was used for a while in the 30s was called Plascon. It's not plastic, it's not bakelite, it's a urea-based composite. And they used this because bakelite only came in brown. If you wanted a different color, RCA might say, hey, for an extra $5, we'll go ahead and spray paint it and put it in an oven and give you cream. And so you'd have a cream-colored radio. Well, some manufacturers said, well, we want to mess around with that. We've got this material called Plascon, and it's cream colored, and this was used primarily in the late 30s through maybe early 40s at best. And after that, manufacturers got away from that. Plascon, it's not completely solid density-wise as bakelite. It's translucent, so if I shined a light in the back here, you'd actually see it show up in the front. The wood radios, again, they're worth the most. They're the most valuable, the hardest to find. Most wood radios have a veneer on them. That veneer is very thin. So for anybody who has a radio and it's got a veneer on it, and you attempt to try to restore it yourself, always be careful about over sanding because you can sand right through that veneer so quickly. It doesn't take much. This radio here, I have this in 3 colors. I have this in black, brown, and in cream. This is a Belmont radio from the late 30s. Extremely colorful. Brilliant in its gloss bakelite, but also the design, extreme Art Deco. And this radio here is a plastic radio from General Electric from the 50s. And what I liked about that was the atomic design on the front of the station dial, along with the bright red color. So what was interesting about how radios transitioned in the 50s, once plastic was introduced, the people in the design side of the house said, hey, there is a tremendous appetite for color. And within 5 years of plastic being introduced, just about every radio was colorized. You hardly ever found a brown colored radio after 1955. It was usually chartreuse, salmon, red, orange, yellow, green, blue. And so a lot of changes very quickly in the radios. Now, the best radios for valuation, 1930s, you have your Atwater cats. I know Mr. Jim Sargent gave a presentation on AKs. I have 2 AKs in my collection, extremely well built. Probably some of the best technology for radios in the early 30s and 50s. They really put a lot of emphasis on the quality of the chassis of those radios. You couldn't go wrong with a Philco, a Zenith, RCA, or Westinghouse. As you got in the mid-30s, again, you start adding more companies like Emerson, Detrola out of Detroit. They made a lot of radios, made some great-looking quality radios. In the late 30s, Zenith, Philco, RCA, your big names, Sears Silvertone. Sears never made a radio. They sold more radios than anybody in 1946, but never made one. At one point in the mid-40s, 46, they had anywhere from 5 to 7 different companies making radios just to keep up with the demand after World War II. So it was just amazing Them and Montgomery Ward's. Montgomery Ward sold a lot of radios under the name brand Airline. Again, Montgomery Ward's never made a radio. They contracted it out. You had two radio companies, Belmont Radio. Belmont made this radio here. And you also had, BR, Wells Gardner, WG, Wells Gardner. You could tell by their ID number, their model numbers, you'll see BR. You always know what kind of radio you got from Montgomery Ward's, if it was a Belmont or if it was a Wells Gardner. Sears also did the same thing too. Best vintage radios for playability. Now, the radios from the 30s are excellent for value. Those are going to be your most valuable radios. Mainly going to be wood. Wood radios are hard to find nowadays, especially without damage to the veneer. Now, typically most radios, when I find a radio, 90% of the time you have damage. You have delamination in the wood, or you got just chunks of it missing. It's hard to find wood radios now that are completely perfect as far as the veneer. When we get in the 40s, because of the new chassis design, really it was a superior design by far. And if you want an everyday player, the 1940s through mid-50s are your best bet. For look, for value, then 30s would be your best. But keep in mind, 1930s radios are very finicky. Even some of your nicest big chassis radios, there's a lot of tweaking on those things to get those to work right. And they're nice. You play them, you unplug them. But with a 40s or 50s radio, because of the design, you have a lot more stability, you have a lot more safety, and you also have the endurance capability of those radios. They'll just play. Vintage radio restoration, when I look at the steps that I follow, the first thing I do when I get a radio, I clean it. I take the radio apart, I clean the chassis. That's the most important thing, starting off, so you want to see what you have. Clean the tubes. I clean the tubes. I clean all the pots, the volume control switch, the tuning capacitor. Then I get to the schematics. I want to take a look at that schematic and see what I have here. I try to get to know the layout of all the capacitors, the resistors, and to make sure that I have a good understanding of what I'm trying to work on. I typically replace the power cord, test and replace the tubes. I replace all the wax capacitors. It's important. If you're going to go ahead and recap a radio from this era, it doesn't make sense to just replace 2 or 3 capacitors. It's best just to replace all your wax capacitors at once, because eventually, even though they might be working, they will go bad. These wax capacitors were designed to last 15, maybe 20 years, which was good for the era. No one expected these radios to last 70, 80, or 90 years. So it's imperative that when you get a vintage radio like this, especially if it's a nice radio, it doesn't cost that much to replace the capacitors. And one of the things I notice with people, they'll get a radio they found it up in Grandpa's closet. It's been sitting there for 40 or 50 years unplayed. By that time, the capacitors have dried out. And I have some examples of some dried up capacitors and what happens when you plug it in, plug the radio in, and 120 volts hits these dried out capacitors, and these things just basically explode or melt. And then you could have other problems. You could have a domino effect. You could have maybe a filament increase in voltage, and now you burn out a $10 tube instead of a $1 capacitor. So it's best, I tell people, it's best to go ahead and cut out these old wax capacitors and then replace them with modern day capacitors, which are much more durable, much more reliable, and the longevity on them is fantastic, and they're very tight in their specifications. The resistors of the era, the carbon-based resistors, actually do pretty well. And but when they drift out of their operating range, I replace them with modern-day resistors. American tubes were very well built, probably the best engineered part of the radio. And especially by the time we get in the 1940s, they already had 2 generations of working on tubes to perfect them. So your 1940, what they call octals, are probably your best tubes. 1950s, they downsized one more time to the peanut style. They're good, but because they've been downsized, they're still generating a lot of heat, and you have failure often, especially with the higher voltage tubes like your 35W4 or your 50C5 tubes. getting a lot of voltage and a lot of heat generating, you no longer have that nice bakelite base that's helping to reduce that heat and minimize the heat transfer. So what happens with a lot of radios, especially in the late 50s when they started introducing these boards they were using, their first early circuit boards, the heat generated by the peanut tubes would cause a lot of fracturing and cracking, and you would actually start getting cold solder breaks. So I stay away from those radios because they're just problems waiting to explode on you at any given time. Electrolytic capacitors. It's important to always replace these electrolytics again. They may play for a while, but these big firecracker-like capacitors, they're very important to help take out the AC that hasn't been picked up by completely eliminated by the rectifier tube. So if you ever have a radio and you hear that AC hum in the background, there's a pretty good possibility that it's the electrolytic capacitors. If you have a radio and it sounds like it's got Martian voice, like talking like this, and it sounds like this, it's probably the wax capacitors have gone bad, especially the coupling caps. Yes, sir?
Where'd you get your schematics? Was that Sam's?
I have 3 different schematics I usually use. Sam's is one of them. They're typically post-war. But if you want to...
when did they stop making?
I think, well, they made them in different types, for different types of equipment, from radios, TVs, cassette recorders. I think they went all the way to the 70s. But for radios, they didn't start till I think 46. So before that, I used Bateman's and Riders. And these all... Bateman's and Riders are free. I'll have a web link for you guys if you want to take a look at that later on. You can download any Riders schematic for free off of nostalgia.air, and I have the link set up at the last slide. And then equipment, I have some basic equipment. You don't need a lot to do restoration of radios. Isolation transformer, very important so you don't electrocute yourself. Tube tester, volt ohm meter, signal generator, and a soldering gun. That's all you really need. Anything else is just overkill. Resources, SAM schematics, Bateman's, Riders. Again, those all, the SAMs you have to typically pay for. You can go to a service and SAMs, you can actually go to the website and get SAM schematics. And there's a lot of different secondary entities that are selling SAM schematics. They're high quality and they have a lot of information on them. But if you want the freebies, the Bateman's and the Riders are a good way to go. I have a tube substitution handbook. I got that from Jim Sargent. It's the first book I ever bought on electronics. I bought it. Jim used to go ahead and sell radio equipment and parts and tubes. It's something they used to do downtown Dallas under the expressway. They used to have it every month. And that's when I first met Jim Sargent. And he sold me a tube substitution handbook. That's one of the most valuable books I've ever had. Vintage Radio Repair Guys. Radio Attic. If you want a good website to go and just look at vintage radios and get an idea, radioattic.com is excellent. There are a bunch of guys that are radio restorers, and they do good work. And they sell radios, but they also post all their radios, and they've got this great archive of radios all the way from manufacturers that began with A to Z for Zenith. And great thing to see. Radio Museum is also nice. It's more of an international website, radiomuseum.org. You just punch in, for instance, let's say if you have a radio, you're not sure what you've got. You just say Zenith, model 6S2R5. Put that in there, you can find all kind of information about that particular radio. The importance of radio schematics. I think it's the roadmap of the radio. And even though most radio chassis are pretty similar, and I don't know what happened there, I think I just lost it, I'm sorry. Every chassis is got its own schematic. And the more you know about how to read a schematic, the easier it is to find a problem when you ever have one. Because you can track it down section by section, getting to the specific capacitor, the specific resistor, the specific point Thank you, Tim. I'm getting a little excited, I guess, here and lost my presentation. One of the things some radio restorers, they'll sit there and they'll try to modify a radio. I never do that. Whatever that schematic says, I put in. One thing I do when I get a radio, whether it be from another radio restorer, I always go through the radios. Because I find a lot of guys will take shortcuts. They, instead of a 0.05 UF capacitor being put in, they'll put in a 0.3 or 0.2, because that's all they have. Will the radio work? Yeah, it may work, but it may be degraded somewhat. So my feeling is that if you want to maintain the value of the radio, you want the radio to work like the engineer who designed it works, put in the correct value of the component that they have listed. I'm not that smart as the engineer that built these radios. So I don't think it's incumbent upon me to go ahead and try to modify something just because. Yeah, you can play games with audio sound quality by changing your capacitors, especially once you get beyond the third tube. You can do that, but I try to keep everything standard. Case restoration. This is just more grunt work than anything else. When you get a case, the first thing you do is you want to remove the knobs, you want to take the chassis out, you want to clean it, and you want to use certain chemicals that I found that work pretty well. Novus is probably the #1 polish cleaner that I've used and found over the years it works extremely well on bakelite and plastic. Good old-fashioned shoe polish works just as well. But again, each radio case is slightly different, so you have to experiment sometimes. But good old-fashioned brown oil-based shoe polish works very well. Always make sure you got Q-tips and toothpicks for those fine little detail areas. When I restore my radios, I go as far as even the knobs in the fine little cracks and corners. I make sure everything's been cleaned and polished so it looks like it did when it came off the showroom floor from the manufacturer. Here's an example of a plastic radio from the early 50s. This is a Westinghouse. This is how I got it. It's pretty rough. It looks like it's been sitting in the garage or someplace for a while. It's got tape residue on it. The picture on the right is after I buffed it out with Novus. That's a front shot. And this is before and after on the chassis. You can see the supersized electrolytic. And the new electrolytics are so much smaller but so much better. This is a dual electrolytic, and I was able to free up a lot of space in that chassis with a 47 and a 30 UF capacitor, electrolytic capacitor. You can see the new wax capacitor is replaced with the yellow caps. And what I try to do with all my radios, when I'm doing a recap, I always dress the leads with heat shrink. A lot of guys don't do that, but it takes a little bit more work, but it mitigates that potential of you putting your hands, pulling out that chassis and inadvertently pressing up and having wires cross. I've seen this happen a lot. There was a radio I picked up at one of our auctions. Guy gave up on it. He did a magnificent job with the recap. I mean, he spent probably tons of hours. He replaced all the resistors, all the caps. It looked beautiful. It didn't play right. So I picked it up, brought it home. I started going section by section. And it was the tightest spot, but he had 2 wires, and they were hairline wires. I mean, they were so small, and they were hiding behind a couple of resistors. He had bundled 2 resistors in parallel together, and by doing that, he pushed it into the circuit, and then he basically inadvertently had made some contact with another bare wire. So again, it's extra work, but I think it goes a long way in resolving issues before they get out of control, because you can spend a lot of time working on a radio and then screwing it up with something as simple as 2 bare wires, and try to find something where you got hundreds of wires that are bare. Because as you know, as we age, our eyesight, even with readers and stuff, it's hard to sometimes get dimensional depth when you're looking, and things just don't look right. Here's another chassis I was working on, a Philco. Again, maybe a little bit better blow up, but you can see that you got your electrolytic capacitors mounted to the side, replaced a large firecracker style dual electrolytic capacitor. The wax capacitors, again, in yellow, all dressed with black heat shrink. Case restoration. If you've got a good radio with a good finish on it to begin with, that is, the wood case radio's got some finish on it, you haven't had a lot of finish loss, suggestion is use this stuff on the left here. It's called Restore Finish. And Restore Finish does a great job. Suggest using 4-aught steel wool, being very careful to rub it, let it sit for a couple of minutes to soak in, but do not dig in. Don't scrub it like it's, you're scrubbing the floor, because you will remove the old finish. If the finish is that far gone and you have to completely strip it, Minwax works really good. Make sure you have your different grades of sandpaper, starting off with your roughest to your finest. Make sure you have wet sandpaper that you can use for your higher final coats. Anywhere between 500 to 1200 works very well. Some of the staples I use for radio repair, you have to always have a can of deoxit. Deoxit is probably the best electrical cleaner, along with CRC for pots. Always have something to blow out, air duster. Make sure you have your wood glues and various other things for brass, such as Brasso. Here is a project I worked on back in around 2011. It was an absolute junker. I paid up for the radio because I wanted that radio, but I had to pay up for it. It was shipped over on a Greyhound bus. This is a Sirius Silvertone, 1937 AM shortwave, model 4465, and one of our club members who did great restorations on cases, he showed me his techniques, and I kind of followed him. The first thing we had to do was we had to put the thing in traction. We had to re-glue all the joints because things it was just falling apart. After letting it sit for 2-3 days after being in traction, I stripped the case. I had to remove the veneer on the sides because the veneer was just delaminating really bad. And luckily the front and the top was in good shape. Next process was to go and stain it. So I got 2 coats of Minwax, let that sit for about a week. And then I started applying the clear coat. And the clear coat, I went with about 6 coats of clear coat on it. Then I put the grill cloth in, along with the bezel and the glass. And there's your final product, 1937 Sirius Silvertone. Remember, showed that a little bit earlier. That radio right there is, I like it a lot. It plays great. It's got the tuning eye. The tuning eye was a fad. It was about a 5-year, 6-year fad because it looked cool. It's nothing more than a tube. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically a tube that has a phosphorus cap on it. And it was the first, I guess if you want to call it, tuning meter. Because the idea was if you're, like say, trying to tune into WBAP, and if you're off the station, the tube on top is going to be green except for kind of a little bit of like a Y. Once you get close to WBAP, that Y starts to close, and when you're dead on the station, it closes completely. So it was a neat thing that went from about 1935 to about 1940-41. And when the war started, they needed that stuff for radar, CRTs. So that put the kibosh on tuning eyes for radios. When radio production started again in 1946, you got to remember, there were no radios produced from 1942 to 1945 because of the War Production Act. All these big companies, General Electric, Westinghouse, RCA, they're all working for Uncle Sam in the war effort. So all those electronics were going into military hardware. But that was the end of the green tuning eye. But it's a great thing if you get one to work. They are very delicate. They can be very expensive, those tubes. The most expensive tuning eye I've seen it come across is the Zenith 6T5. That thing runs anywhere from $50 to $150 on eBay if you can get one. They're pretty rare. Maintenance and care chassis. A lot of the old timers will tell me, turn on a radio at least once a month. you want to go ahead and have that electricity flow through those components just to go ahead and allow them to reform. And, you know, I don't know the validity of that, but I practice it. And a lot of radios I don't practice because I got too many of them. But at least for 5 minutes, just to let that electricity flow. Cases, the really only thing you need to do with wood cases and bakelite is keep them out of the sun. And then subsequently for wood, Johnson's paste wax works pretty good for cleaning and waxing. You don't have to have anything expensive. That old stuff worked pretty well on these old radios because that's what they used back then. On bakelite, plastic, again, a little Novus every once in a while, a little shoe polish, works wonders. Final thoughts, is the AM band going away? You may have heard on the news lately that there's movement afoot to get rid of the AM band for commercial radio. Some of the manufacturers, auto manufacturers, have actually stopped carrying the AM band on their radios, mainly a lot of the foreign brands. And those that are making electric vehicles, some of the manufacturers are claiming that because of the motors on the electric vehicles, it produces an excessive amount of hum and static noise on AM. So that's the rationale they're using to try to get rid of it. There is a movement afoot right now by broadcasters, listeners, even some people in Congress to go ahead and put the kibosh on that and have AM. Now AM is still around. We got 4,200 stations nationwide. About 35 to 38% are minority owned. On top of that, AM is still the backbone of the emergency alert system. The emergency alert system is what delivers those tornado warnings, the flash flood warnings, the amber alerts, presidential messages. And it's mainly the AM stations because you're like WBAP 820 is a 50,000 watt station and it can broadcast all across North Texas. All the other stations in the North Texas area monitor WBAP and the National Weather Service to ensure that they get the emergency alert system notifications. So that's another reason to keep AM. So I think at least, and there's another one there, that the business about 36% are minority owned. They do carry a lot of weight, and Congress does listen when you get a lot of groups that will pull together and voice their opinion about something being either discarded or moved to a different entity. So with that said, here are some of the resources I mentioned earlier. RadioAddict.com is a great resource. If you just want to look at radios and see what's out there from manufacturer to manufacturer. RadioMuseum.org is more information that you could glean about what kind of tube count you have in that radio, where it was produced, what year it was made. And then finally, schematics, nostalgiaair.org. You want some free schematics, nostalgiaair.org. Traditionally use riders. And they're not as good as I'd say as a Sam's, but for free, not bad. So again, thanks for the hospitality. For anybody that would like to come on by, they want to see more radios, I have some at the Frisco Mercantile. Again, the radios are mainly wood and bakelite and plastic, and they make a great gift if you're looking for something unique. So at this point in time, we have time for some questions?
Sure.
All right. Yes, sir.
When did they start making the table type in AM FM?
The first AM radios I saw in table were probably as early as 3940. Philco in particular, I sold one radio. It was what they call a slant front from 1939, and one of the versions had early FM. Now that early FM was much lower in frequency, and at some point in time, I think it was around late 40s, the FCC gave us our current range of the FM band from 88 to 108, whatever it is now. And, but FM, the early receivers, the first AM receivers, Zenith made a lot of them, late 40s, early 50s, they just weren't that good. It took another 15, 20 years for FM receivers to reach that quality level, that AM, that level of, the circuits just weren't designed to the point that you could count on them. You could buy an AM FM receiver, I find from the late 40s, early 50s, that AM is going to work. Half the time the FM won't work that well at all. And you have some of your best people working on those receivers to fix them, they still can't get them to work right. So I stay away from them. Any other questions?
Okay.
Okay.
We're done. Were you going to do
Yeah.
We're going to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you explain what you're getting ready to do.
Well, I have a lot of radios, and I thought it'd be appropriate that I bring a radio that maybe that I give away. And I have a nice Philco radio from 1946 that is in a state that I typically get radios in. That is, it needs to be completely gone through. It needs to have the chassis recapped, and it also needs to have the case completely clean, buffed, and polished to make it look like it did like one of these radios. So whoever the lucky winner of this radio is, I'd like you to come up front, take a look at it, take a picture of it, give me your contact information, and I'll have this radio completely done for you by Christmas. So it'll be a nice Christmas gift for whoever gets this.
Whoever gets it. Okay, I'll let you pull it.
Da-da-da-da-da-da. And I'll let you read it since I don't have my readers on.
731-116. 116.
You have to be present.
Anybody? Yeah, you have to be present to win.
There it is.
So if you'll come up and give Walt your information. Thank you, Walt.
You're welcome.
With that,